Hey everyone, just wanted to give you a quick update on the plants and mushrooms, mostly plants, that I'm seeing up this way, and give a little overview of the reading that we had that was due for today, April 15th. So this past weekend, I spent hiking with my friend Max down in Bear Mountain State Park toward New York City. It's about an hour north of New York City. And while I was down there, I saw Hepatica, or that is lungwort, I believe. It's called Hepatica for now. That's a member of the ranunculus family. It's a spring ephemeral. So spring ephemerals are coming out now. These are plants that spend the spring for about a month or so with their leaves out and their flowers out. So the flowers are for reproduction. They create their seeds to perpetuate themselves into the next generation. And then their leaves catch a lot of sunlight before the tree leaves come out. So if you go into woods that are less disturbed, you'll find a lot of these coming out in the coming months. Hepatica, trout lily, spring beauty, violets. A lot of these different plants are ephemerals, violets less so. But anyway, saw Hepatica. April had posted a picture of that from Washington, D.C. from a week or two ago. So it's nice to see that warmth slowly moving up north. Max and I were hoping to find a bunch of forageable stuff, but it didn't quite pan out where we were. I think in the mountains that we were hiking in, it was slightly higher than the roads that we were driving on. But toward the roads, we saw garlic mustard and onion grass coming out in abundance. So garlic mustard, I'll talk about it later, but it's a member of the Brassica family. And onion grass is in that Amaryllidaceae, the Amaryllis family, the subfamily Alioideae. There was also barberry leafing out. So Japanese and European barberry are two introduced species that are very common, particularly in the Northeast and Wisconsin. They were brought over because they're deer resistant, but they leaf out really early in the spring. They produce really pretty red berries that are pretty bitter and tart, but they contain something called berberine, which is an antimicrobial alkaloid. It's when you cut open their roots or their bark, you see yellow on the inside. That is berberine. I can go further into barberry in another video. One thing to note about barberry is that it is an indicator for ticks. The early leafing out and the canopy shape makes the relative humidity under the plant very high, so ticks are able to proliferate there in abundance. So if you're walking in the woods and you come across a bunch of barberry, be sure to check yourself for ticks because they do tend to be more common there. We didn't have any ticks on us during this hike, which was a little bit concerning for me considering what I would expect with the plants there. So I'm wondering if maybe they're doing some sort of tick control over that way because it's such a populated area. I don't know. But barberry is leafing out. And then we had some false hellebore or Veratrum viridae coming out. This plant it's a beautiful plant. It's generally in swamps and wet places and is very, very, very toxic. So this would be a low dose botanical. I wouldn't personally use it, but it can lower blood pressure by slowing your heart rate. So definitely a plant that you would not want to eat, but it is beautiful to look at. Elderberry was starting to throw out its little buds and flowers. So the flowers and the buds come out at the same time. So you'll see these little looks like little mini groups of grapes. Those are coming out. Big tooth aspen is flowering all over the place. So you'll see in the woods where there's no leaves on the trees yet, you'll see just these white, big trees that are colored white with all their little catkins coming out. Dwarf ginseng was a fun one that I saw leafing up. So ginseng panax quinquefolia is the very, very over-harvested plant of the States. The Jesuits actually saw it up in Canada and realized that if they were to dig a bunch of the stuff and sell it to China, they could create a huge market out of it. There's Chinese ginseng, which was also over-harvested. But this market actually fueled a lot of wealth in the States, or not the States at the time, this was the 1700s. But that plant has been severely over-harvested, but it is promising to see some of its relatives still doing quite well. Another relative of ginseng that we saw was Aurelia. I'm not sure if it was Aurelia spinosa or Aurelia alata. There's devil walking stick, and then there's another species that's been introduced from, I'm not sure if it's Japan or China, but they're very hard to tell apart, and I will attach a link to New York Botanical Gardens file that talks about common plants that look very similar to each other. So native species and introduced species that look very similar. They're often very closely related, but there are some key differences that you can note. Apparently the leaves, the little buds on these plants are edible. I had a little taste. It was very nice. I've seen some foragers harvesting them, but yeah, they're a fun one to keep an eye out for because they have really, really spiny stalks and leaves, but apparently are edible, and they're in the ginseng family. So one of your assignments for this week was to find your local native plant society or botanical garden or any group associated with plants. The point of this is to get you involved with your local experts. We're trying to learn with each other here, but nothing really beats face-to-face time. So if you can, try to find a native plant group. I know our native plant group has a spring ephemerals walk going on at the Cornell Botanic Garden, so we're fortunate enough to live near a botanic garden here. If you don't have any group like that that's around, try to make one yourself. Invite some friends over for a walk. Just have people explore what's going on in your area, and we've been doing that a couple times here. So getting people of different ages together to go walking is a really good way to really learn this stuff. As for the readings that we had this week, we had Brassicaceae and Betulaceae, and then I'm going to do a separate video on the mushrooms just to keep things a little bit more grouped together. So Brassicaceae, this is the broccoli family or the mustard family. This is one of the more common flowers that you'll see this time of year. These tend to be annual or biennial plants. So annual plants, they grow one season, produce seeds, and then die off. Biennial, they grow one season, put all their energy in the root, and then the spring following year, they put all that energy into a flower and then produce seeds. So you'll see a lot of these brassica flowers. They tend to be yellow and white, but there is also, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's an introduced species that has a purple flower that'll come a little bit after some of these earlier ones. But you'll commonly see a lot of cresses in gardens now. They look like a mini version of watercress, which is also in the broccoli family. All these brassicas have 4 petals and 6 stamens, so 6 pollen-producing parts, 2 of which are shorter than the other 4. So if you got a loop, that little 10 times magnification, it's almost like a little mini magnifying glass, you can look in there and you can see that those stamens are a little shorter than the other 4, and it helps you to count and get a more accurate ID. The flowers tend to look like an H or an X in their arrangement, so they're pretty easy to ID, and then if you crush them up, you can often smell that kind of broccoli, sulfury, mustardy smell. Yeah. So that sulfury smell is basically an irritant. A lot of insects can't really digest that stuff, so they avoid these broccoli brassicas. But the cabbage moth, so you'll often see a lot of white moths, white butterflies around, and that is a cabbage moth that was brought over, I'm pretty sure, from Europe, and it eats brassicas, so that can be very common butterfly that we see, and also one that you'll notice you'll have little green caterpillars on your cabbages soon after you'll see them. Brassicas tend to be in disturbed spaces, so very common in gardening spaces and agricultural areas. Most of them are edible. I can't think of any off the top of my head that are not edible. I hesitate to say all are edible, but yeah, they're a pretty safe family to eat. One of the more conspicuous ones now is garlic mustard. This is an introduced invasive species. The Latin name is Aliaria petiolata, and it's an introduced invasive that is also allelopathic. So allelopathy is when a plant secretes chemicals that suppress the growth of other plants. And garlic mustard has kind of a two-pronged attack where it decreases the growth of other plants directly, but also decreases the growth of the fungi that associate with those plants. So a really interesting invasion happening with that. After 10 to 15 years, it seems to almost kill itself off because they think that the microbiome that it associated with back in Europe didn't come across the pond. So here it doesn't survive as well because it doesn't have its associated microbiome, which would help it resist its own allelopathy. It is associated with earthworms. They're not sure if the earthworms come in first, change the soil structure, and then garlic mustard can come in, or vice versa. But there is that association, which is good to know. Different brassicas. So when you go to the stores and you eat, you get a diversity of vegetables. You get kale, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, collard greens, and Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi. Cook it up into a big meal. You think you get this very diverse meal. That is all one species. Those are different varieties of Brassica oleracea. So when we think we're having a diversity of plants in our diet, we should really look at what is the actual species that we're eating. So oftentimes things like that happen where you have one plant that does really well, and over thousands of years people have selected for different varieties of that same species. Mario sent in a picture of what I think might have been creasy greens or Brassica nigra, not really sure, but you'll see a lot of these yellow flowers around this time of year. Next plant family, Betulaceae. This is the birch family, also the hazelnut family. So these will have alternate leaves, and each leaf will have veins extending from the central vein, so it's called pinnate. You'll see catkins coming out. So catkins are like long, kind of dangling flower stalks that you'll often see in trees. The Betulaceae is monoecious, so it has the pollen-producing and ovary-producing plants on the same tree. That means that they can self-pollinate. Members include hazelnut, musclewood, hop hornbeam, alder, and birch. Alder is very interesting because it fixes nitrogen. So if you wanted to do improve your soils, you could plant a lot of alder and then coppice them, which means you cut them down to the ground every 5 years and then let the coppice material build up nitrogen. Birches make a really delicious tea, so I'll take some of the twigs kind of year round, not as much in the winter, but spring through fall. You can cut the twigs and put it in some hot water, let it steep for about 10 minutes to a half hour, and you'll get a really nice tea. It has methyl salicylate in it, which is the wintergreen smell, and the methyl salicylates are, they help kind of like blood thinning. I kind of feel like there's a tendency toward the heart with them. Very relaxing, very delicious, and that's a really good tea to have around. Birches can sometimes look like cherry trees or like beech trees, but birches have doubly alternate leaves. So if you had a stalk like this, they would have leaf coming off here, leaf coming off here alternately, but instead of just one leaf, there'd be two. So you'll have 2 leaves, and then 2 leaves, and then 2 leaves. So that's a good way to distinguish them. Notice those 2 leaves on each point where leaves come off of the branch. You can tap birches. Their sugar content for this, the syrup or the sap is much lower than maple, but you can make like a birch wine or something like that. But you want to make sure that you close up that hole after you tap it. I'm not very familiar with this, so I would just recommend trying to figure out how to close up that hole or finding somebody who does this otherwise. So that's it for this week in terms of their plant reading, and I'm going to upload another video about collecting mushrooms, which will go off of the reading that I gave you for this week. Anyway, I'll see you in that video.